What up, fam? We got to talk about some pseudoscience, and that being Jupiter. They claim that this is the clearest picture ever taken of Jupiter, which is really just CGI from NASA, but allegedly it's from their Juno cam in 2019. All right, now this is what Jupiter looks like under a very nice telescope. This footage is from David Shane. If you don't know who he is, go follow him. Dude's a legend.
So let's take a look at Jupiter under telescope. Again, pseudoscience versus reality, like he said. That's what you see with Jupiter, a so-called planet. If you want to see anything else, you have to rely on NASA. So there's what you can demonstrate and what the pseudoscientific intelligentsia is telling us that they can demonstrate. But you have to understand, when you talk about the scientific method, something has to be observable, measurable, testable, and repeatable. Without the repeatability, it is no proof. So just because NASA tells you that something looks a certain way, that is no evidence unless it can be repeated. Then you might say, oh, Z, what about all these other countries? They have things in space and they're seeing the same thing. And I'll say to you, cool story.
The legend. This is what Jupiter actually looks like. So they claim that Jupiter is just shy of 400 million miles away. Yeah, you heard that right. 400 million miles away.
I'll say it again. 400 million. They say the sun is 93 million. 93 million miles from us. And they say Jupiter's 400 million. What is that? Roughly 4 times? Which would be considered 4 astronomical units from the sun. An astronomical unit is that 93 million miles from the supposed sun, or the supposed 93 million miles from the sun to Earth.
And you believe that? We go outside and we see a light in the sky, and you think it's this other world that's 400 million miles away? Are you kidding me? And this little red dot right here, you're supposed to believe that that's bigger than the entire Earth. Bruh, talk about pseudoscience. Yeah, this right here, which is just more CGI, you believe that that's bigger than the entire Earth.
So that picture right there of the Jupiter storm there, that red dot, they tell you that there's a big probe out there, 400 million miles away, that we're perfectly controlling, that it could fly by this huge gas giant planet, Jupiter, and not be sucked into its gravity, because we have it all planned out, all the motions and mechanisms of the planets. See, the story is incredulous, yet everybody believes it.
That's absurd. That's insanity. You have no proof of that whatsoever. You guys believe that Jupiter is so big that you could fit over 1,300 Earths in Jupiter. You guys actually believe that. All right, so here's a comparison for you. If the Earth was in a heliocentric model and that was the ball, this would be the size of Jupiter. That's absurd. You guys make these absurd claims that it's this big and this far away and it's made out of all these gases, etc. That's nonsense. You have no proof of that at all. At all. You guys have to say that it's that big because it's the only way to match your little heliosexual model.
And he nailed it there. You have to say it's that big. You see, when you look at things like angular size and you look at the movements of these wandering stars, these so-called planets in the sky, once you start making up the math, which is derived off the transit of Venus in front of our sun, which was based on an ingenious assumption, is the quote, that Venus has the same radius as Earth. Based on that ingenious assumption, all the distances and sizes of the planets are derived off an assumption. Why did it take the flat earthers to dig through all the catacombs of so-called science to relay this to you? Why? Why did it take a flat earther or a bunch of flat earthers to sit here and tell you that because Kepler theorized a heliocentric model with scaling in AU units, and then based off the angular size of Venus transiting the sun, off an ingenious assumption of Venus's radius and thus diameter, well, all the sizes and distances of the planets were derived. But of course, then they tell us, well, now we verified that because we're there. We sent a probe to Venus, dummy flat earthers. Don't you know that? We sent probes out to deep space. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 are still going. So I guess that assumption was ingenious. Good job. When you saw a dot that we know as Venus transit the sun, and you just assumed, well, I think that little speck of dot is just as big as Earth. That was ingenious. How'd you nail it? Because it turns out when we sent a bunch of shit up there, it all worked out perfectly. Just like how science fiction predicted what space is decades, if not more than a century. If you looked in the mid-1800s and some of the stories from Jules Verne and all these people. Again, ingenious assumptions on science fiction's part, because in stories and then later movies, they exactly predicted exactly what space would be. They knew it would be a vacuum where things float, where you can have things like satellites, and that we can go to the moon using rocket booster technology and come back. Yeah. A lot of ingenious assumptions with these scientists.
You wouldn't be able to see something, let alone with your naked eye, or with a camera, you wouldn't even be able to resolve something that's 400 million miles away. That's absurd. Here's another CGI from their Juno cam that you guys think is real. I hate to break it to you, friends, but this is not real. So you guys need to actually wake up and stop living in the Matrix and taking the blue pill. Because we're out here exposing the lies while you guys are staying indoctrinated, deceived, and believing complete nonsense.
I like what he said there. If you think you could see and resolve with your vision something 400 million miles away, well, you better think again. Let's talk about a little something called light dissipation and how light dissipates. You can look at a formula. Anybody could look it up. It's called the inverse square. Light dissipates at the inverse of its square. Sound does the same thing. That's how energy dissipates, because it does so in a 3D domain. There's an x-axis, there's a y-axis, and there's a z-axis. Turns out we live in a 3D reality. Who would have thought? Light dissipates at the inverse of its square. What that means is, at each doubling of distance, it's 1/4 of its light intensity. Not a half, it's a quarter. So if you are, let's say, 10 feet away from a light bulb, and there's X intensity, if you then move 20 feet away from that light bulb, it is now 25% of that X intensity. Anybody who knows anything about math can understand very quickly that because it's a non-linear decrease in light intensity, you wouldn't have to go very far before you couldn't see a thing. Just like you don't have to go very far before you couldn't hear a thing. Again, all depending on the baseline intensity. What are you saying, Z? What are you saying, Z? What I'm saying is you couldn't see anything 400 million miles away, no matter how big or bright it was. And especially, you couldn't see Jupiter 400 million miles away if it's reflecting the sun's light. Because think about it. Not only are we seeing it from, I guess if we're in a certain bit of our supposed orbit, it's 500 million miles away. But again, we're seeing reflected light. So what they're saying is that light travels from the sun. And we know how bright the sun is at 93 million miles, because we apparently experienced that, right? So what they're telling us is that same sun, that light is traveling 400 million miles to Jupiter, where it's being reflected off a big ball of gas, coming back another 300 million or even 500 million to us. And they're telling us, yeah, you could see that. Sorry, it's impossible. And I'll go back to my standard refrain. You don't live on a globe and you don't live in a solar system because it is scientifically impossible.